All right, you guys ready to start? All right, sound good? Okay. Well, thank you guys for coming. It really means a lot, especially a topic like this, which is not always covered as much because it's one of those areas that kind of slips through the cracks. But I think more and more these days, it's going to become more and more of an issue, which is, of course, data obfuscation. So, of course, any employer or anything I'm associated with, not associated with that at all, shouldn't be viewed by anyone, etc. Just generic disclaimer. So, for those of you guys who don't know me, I'm Parker, math geek, always amateur mathematician, Gen 2 on everything. People always troll me about that. And I do mess with kernels and like to crash them once in a while. It's kind of fun. But I kind of have a background of being a red teamer, but also going back and forth as a cryptographer and mathematician. So it's kind of a weird perspective, but it's also kind of fun because you can do a lot of trolling. And currently, now I run a DevOps automation company, which is not related to old work and has nothing related to any of this. So this is a primer on data obfuscation. So we're going to go through the basics of crypto because a lot of people, the only thing they hear about crypto is don't implement it yourself, which in some situations it makes sense to implement your own crypto and go through some situations where actually it's better to do that, but it's more forgiving. And then we're going to actually go through and we're going to find a non-standard crypto problem, and together we're going to design a crypto algorithm right here and go through all the steps, go through what we forgot and where we messed up and how to fix it the whole way through. So that's kind of the plan for the day. I'm going to go quickly, and what I'm going to try to do is make it so we keep going back to things so that even if you guys lose things for a bit, we can always come back. So we're going to start out with entropy, which pretty much every single non-implementation bug, like not Heartbleed, which is kind of a crazy thing. Besides that, pretty much all crypto issues are a lack of entropy somewhere. You can successfully make a guess. And if you can make a guess more easily, then you have a chance at breaking it. If you have no idea if you're right or wrong, and if you have no idea how to break it without brute forcing the key, generally you're going to have a bad time. And then we're going to go through kind of discrete log problem, basics of crypto, just because the reason we're going to do that is for those of you who are not familiar, I want to get everyone into that mindset because I don't want this to be a talk of, I developed this. I want this to be an ongoing discussion and everyone here to start implementing things like this and playing around because it's actually quite a bit of fun. At least I think so. So what makes and breaks entropy? What should you think about? First of all, how long does it take to make a guess? If you have a perfect crypto system and you have a 256-bit key size, ideally you need 2 to the 256 guesses, which at that point makes it impractical. And so you have to understand how many guesses do you have to make. But also, if you make a guess, if you guess what the key is, right? Are you correct? A lot of times if you're trying to decrypt SSL, if you pick a random AES key and you decrypt it and the data makes sense, you might have a good shot. But there are some situations we're going to look at that where we can have it so that if you decrypt the data, you can decrypt it into something that makes sense, but isn't the actual plain text. And then the other part too is if you know part of the key, if you know part of the message, can you extract the rest? Because sometimes because in that situation, you can start brute forcing part of a key. Something makes sense. Okay, I'm getting somewhere. I'm going to keep going. And most times when crypto breaks, this is what happens. So let's look at LM hashes, right? Because everyone here has broken LM hashes, and that's really easy. Even if it was a good hashing algorithm, one big issue, even back in the day, was only capital letters would go in there. So even if you didn't find a flaw in the hash itself, you can easily brute force the entire plain text space and figure out where a collision is, what would hash into that value very easily. And it's also, I bring this up too because everyone thinks, RSA is some magical tool, and whenever you use it, the auditor should check the box. But there's a lot of problems with public key crypto if it's used the wrong way. For example, let's say you had CVV numbers and someone was going to encrypt them using RSA. Well, if the public key was available, which sometimes it is, it's going in there, you find the public key. An auditor would probably check the box. A QSA would generally do that because, oh, cool, RSA, shiny. And problem is, if it's only a 3-digit number, what do? You take the public key. There's only 1,000 possibilities of 3-digit numbers, 10 times 10 times 10, right? So you go through all 1,000 of them, which for a computer, 1,000's a tiny number. Encrypt them all, match them with the ciphertext. There you go. Now you have a mapping. So it's not necessarily the algorithm; it's how you use it. So even if you're not implementing your own crypto, you should generally have some idea of how it works when you're designing a crypto system, because you can run into problems. And of course, memory management, you're going to have a really bad time if you expose plain text when someone sends a request. Bad things, which kind of broke everything. So that's a once in a while thing when that happens. Now, one example of this, and part of this too is since we are going to implement our own crypto, I'm going to make a point of don't implement your own TLS, because we're going to actually go through a flaw that was a real TLS issue. But that penguin we can all tell that's Tux the penguin, right? Everyone can tell that's him, pretty much. He's been encrypted with AES. What went wrong? Well, AES is a block cipher. So if you have a 256-bit message, then generally AES is very hard to break for that. But the trivial way to implement something over a bigger message is, let's encrypt block by block. Where's the problem here? Well, if you go block by block, you know the ciphertext. You might have some idea of what the plain text is. Like, if someone did this for a web request, usually you know what most of that web request is. So at that point, you would just take the encrypted data you see, take the plain text you know it is, and in 256-bit chunks, you have a mapping from one to another. And wherever the session ID would be, you can extract parts of that, and then you could decrypt the message. So that's why we invented things like cipher block chaining, which all that does is the function E encrypts the plain text, but it encrypts the plain text XORed with the last block of ciphertext. And the reason they did this was to avoid that image there. Now what's the problem. So I guess, I don't know if sound will work if I go there, but the ciphertext is a known value to an interceptor. So you actually can kind of undo that. Now, the issue is you still have to make a guess. But the problem is with CVC, if you have a client-side attack, I won't necessarily go through there. This is the math for the people who are actually interested. I can go through slightly. But essentially what you do is you guess J to the I. You have multiple requests, and you inject your own plain text into there. If it encrypts into the proper ciphertext, you've got it. So essentially you're using that known plain text, like we talked about with RSA, but you'll have to do it over 1,000 times. But having the ability to know that if you make a guess and you're correct, then you can keep making a lot of guesses, because guessing the plain text is way easier than guessing a key. A key is totally random. You generally, in most encrypted messages, can guess most of the plain text. And so, but now we're actually going to take a step back and go before before computers were even a thing. So, back in the Roman days where no one had heard of crypto, so security by obscurity actually helped. I'm sure most people here have heard of the Caesar cipher. If you haven't, you might have used it as a kid, where you'd say the key is 7, so you shift everything 7 letters. And so those kinds of shifts, which actually the shifting of letters eventually evolved into a XOR on the computer, but a lot of crypto is still based off of that, but that's the first ever cipher. Another one is, of course, the substitution cipher, which you see in a lot of the cryptograms in the newspapers, which I don't even know if newspapers exist anymore, but that's when they used to have those. And of course, if you had the spacing, you would find I and A and be able to break those. But your key space is really small too, especially with cryptograms, because you only have 26 letters. Though actually it might be interesting to try to do them in Chinese, because that cipher actually might be somewhat valid to not a computer, because you have a 20,000 character set. This might actually be interesting. So then, what the people did, so substitution cipher didn't work. So they said, well, what was the problem with the Caesar cipher? Your key is very small. So if you're not using a computer, how do you make a bigger key? You have a Vigenère cipher. where you take multiple letters, like you're mapping A to 1, B to 2 to create your key as a trivial hash, because for computers. And so you take a word, usually, or a few random letters, and you take this, and now you take each key, shift a letter, take the second letter of your key, shift by that much, and repeat through there. If the key is long enough, this is actually a valid cipher. And as someone in this room will maybe tell you if you ask him afterwards, if he wants to mention, Vigenère cipher was used by the military and was used by the NSA in the 60s and 70s, and up before computers really became a thing and computer-based crypto. That was actually used in wars that many of us in the room were actually even alive to see. So now let's fast forward to modern crypto, because all those methods completely died when a computer happened. And later in this talk, we're going to show how they die when we're trying to do things like encrypt payloads and to improve privacy. But the reason I'm going through there, it's not for nothing. I want to go through what the thinking is, because I don't want to just tell people. I want everyone to be thinking this way, because I love this and I'd love for other people to start playing around with this too. So confusion and diffusion, which really is a fancy way of saying, if you guess part of the key, can you reverse it? If you know what the plain text and ciphertext would be and you can get the key from that, that's a bad thing, because you can guess the plain text. If you get part of the message, can you go back and try some other things and work your way backwards into getting the actual plain text, and not even if you get the key. That's what confusion and diffusion is. However, when the NSA was choosing AES as a cipher, there were other ciphers that actually were more secure. And it wasn't some conspiracy theory that they were reducing the cipher strength, but it has to perform. Because part of the mission, too, was they wanted people to encrypt data, because there's a huge impact if people aren't encrypting. So even with DES, the reason it was 56 bits is people wanted it had to be practical to be used. And that was, of course, the minimum back then. But then, of course, an attack that was theoretical eventually became very practical today, and now someone's phone could probably even crack DES. Thank you, Moore's Law. So I'll go into the methods of shared key crypto. The basics of shared key, I'll go really quickly with this, is you got to do some crunching, move bits around so that it takes a decent amount of time to encrypt it, so you can't just try to brute force the key. And it has to be a big enough key. But it has to be something that works very fast when you do it once, but that time has to add up. The nice thing about that is you can choose pretty much whatever algebraic structure you want, which is why, in addition to being faster, shared key is always more secure. That's why you usually see shared key algorithms used and then public key to exchange the keys, because shared key is faster, more secure. There's no reason not to use it except when Alice and Bob are initially starting their communications. So, but of course with public key, it's all about the discrete log problem. I won't go too quick. The people here know how that works. I'm not going to bore them, but essentially solving for x there is very hard. And so it's not an exponential thing. It's not with the real numbers. Of course, logarithms are easy, but this is modulo n. So those don't know anything above n. You divide it by n, find the remainder, and that's what the modulus is. But that problem is pretty much the foundation of all public key cryptography. The reason I mention that is your algebraic structure is set to having to have a discrete log. We have some flexibility, like all the work with elliptic curves. You create a new discrete log problem, but that's one other reason that you have some issues there, because you're limited to a structure that has the two types of keys. And as I said earlier, the discrete log problem can really suck, but actually the reason I bring this up again is when we go into the payload crypto, there was a cipher designed based on RSA, but the way you fix something like this is if you have, instead of one ciphertext for every plaintext, if you have 10,000 ciphertexts for every plaintext and you can go back, now it becomes a lot harder. So, but where are we lacking? Because generally with TLS, everyone's working very hard on that. We generally know it works. Don't try to re-implement it. You're gonna mess it up, as every dev is told, and correctly so. But we're just trying to confuse and diffuse. When you are encrypting something, usually over TLS, you're going to, it's no secret that you're sending encrypted data. It's no secret you're browsing a page over HTTPS. However, when you don't want to show that, like if you have an SSL inspection scenario, if someone's man-in-the-middling, if there's a key escrow program, God forbid, and I hope that never happens, and we're actually going to troll anyone who mentions that and show them that what they're proposing is mathematically impossible because it's fun to troll them. And so, FBI, let's troll them a little bit. But so, the other problem too is we can't, all the modern crypto, the rubber hose attack still remains a valid cryptographic attack for most crypto out there. You can hit someone's head with a hammer until they tell you the password. Hopefully they don't forget. But it still works. But I'd like to actually address that and find ways that we can get around the rubber hose attack. So, one cool cipher we're going back to, and we're going to come back to this later, is if you want entropy when you're avoiding AV, you can take RSA, right, and you can multiply by a random number. But when n is your modulus, instead if you're doing everything mod n squared, you can multiply by a random number raised to the n. Because r n to the phi of n, phi is the number of digits less than n relatively prime to n. That's Euler's theorem. And if someone has questions about that later, we can go over it. I don't want to bore people because I don't know if everyone's really into math here. But you can essentially turn that into 1. So you're multiplying the ciphertext by 1 when you do that, when you're changing it, when you're encrypting. But now r to the n, there's a lot of possibilities, mod n squared, and so now you have tons and tons of ciphertext. And usually those n's are a 100-digit prime number times another 100-digit prime number. So that's how many ciphertexts are there is a 10,000-digit number, and there's some limitations that get slightly smaller, but that whole known plaintext, now that's out the window. But now, so now we're going to payloads. So now we're getting to the meat of this. I'm sorry for the long primer. I just felt that it would help because the last thing I'd want to do is to keep rambling. And I really don't want to just talk about ideas I have. I want everyone to come up with stuff. So, but generally, use the right tool. A lot of payload cryptors have gotten better. Remember when they always used to use AES and you just AES encrypt your payload, and everyone's like, oh my god, FireEye can detect it! And then their stock goes way up. And then people realized, oh, well, the cryptors just were using the wrong algorithm, they actually can't do anything, and then their stock went way down. So it turns out there was a lot of crap there. But the problem on the red team side, when we weren't breaking it, is we weren't using the right tool, as shown there. So, what changes in our situation there? Because when you're designing crypto and obfuscation, you have to figure out, what does the attacker see? What does Eve see when Alice and Bob are sending a message? Problem is, when you're trying to encrypt something for your victim and you're running code on their machine, it's gonna have to be decrypted on their machine. That key will be on there. So using a cipher to try to hide that because you think someone would actually try to break the AES or whatever you're using, they're not going to bother. You have the key on their box. It does not matter. And all these ciphers were designed with, hey, we know it's encrypted. We don't have to hide ourselves. We don't have to obfuscate our algorithms. And so they even have known S boxes. If you've seen that with AES, where you permute the data. Why do they do that? Why do they move byte from byte around? So that you can't guess anymore. And so you end up with these known S boxes. That's an easy signature, and now you have a signature for your payload cryptor. Not good. That's exactly what we don't want. So, as we know, they are absolutely the wrong ciphers. It's not worth doing for those. So one method you can do when you're trying to do payload crypto, I just want to go through this, is if you're setting up a function pointer to a set of data, data's in memory, and you can just generally execute code. Once you have code execution on any box, just in a generic sense. So the thing is, if you have an image file, you're parsing an image. So many programs do that, and all you have to do is a call instruction. Nobody's going to blacklist a call instruction because that AV company would be out of business very quickly. And you can move through any image file, and no one's going to blacklist a bunch of lolcats on the internet unless they're all together. But if you just keep changing it to, oh, grab these bytes and grab that image, now it's significantly harder to sig. And AV is not going to be able to scan memory. Maybe it'll do something in a sandbox, but there's a lot of ways to detect that you're in a sandbox. And if AV is scanning memory, if you think semantic back in the early 2000s was slow, yeah, not doable. So the other thing too, when we're thinking about this process, what would a human and a machine catch? So computers are not grammar police. You're probably not going to make some AV act as a grammar police, because as funny as that would be, you would have significant amount of false positives. So of course, I mentioned a fail of mine. So the first thing there is like, don't you miss me, versus you miss my mom. True story, by the way. I was joking about someone who was going to come to a conference and was based in Beijing. I was like, oh, don't you miss me? You should come. And I actually said to her, you miss my mom. And yes, maybe I should practice a little more before messaging my friends that way, but it was kind of funny. A computer won't catch that, but a human trained with that would absolutely catch it. So, our crypto here, we're generally trying to move into the steganography field. What is the difference between steganography and cryptography? Steganography is not just a bunch of images you find, what's the hidden image on the CTF problem, find the least significant bits. There's a much larger scope there. What it really is you make your message look like something else. So over the network path, you can use Stego. And so one example is DNS tunneling, which we use a lot. Why is it so hard to catch? Because you have to let DNS requests out. And if you're hitting a DNS server with a bunch of host names, any heuristics, all heuristics are just going to see, oh, that's just DNS. Okay, allow that. And, well, your perimeter's broken, and that's sad for a lot of companies who spend lots and lots of money on their perimeter, and people at RSA tell them that. It's a pretty good hustle, though. It's worked for a while until they realize it's not all working. So, essentially, with Stego, you need security by obscurity. Because if you want something not to exist, you have to not tell someone about that. So the whole adage security by obscurity doesn't work. Well, when it's your only choice, that's what you used. That's why Caesar had, back in the Roman days, they had to use a Caesar cipher. Even though someone who knows about it would catch it, it worked. That's what they had. And so, when you're going to Stego, what looks legitimate? Text is, of course, my favorite. You can't encode that much. And I'm not going to repeat a previous talk, but mess around with stuff like drunk type Stego, white space. You can even put white space for bits and then have a key in there in the text hidden. So there's lots of different things. It really helps with data over the wire, but also with stored data, if you make it look like something else, it can really confuse anyone doing forensics. And mentioning this always gets some people who are doing blue team stuff, and they're like, yeah, malware is starting to do this, embed itself in files just to really confuse the forensics people. But you know what? It works, because there's usually a time block with how long they look at it. So even with a human looking in a forensic situation, if the actual malware is in a bunch of lolcats and you're parsing for various bits stored, and you store that in white space somewhere where it looks like someone was just rambling on and just couldn't use their tab and their spacebar key, well, that's actually your malware. It's going to take them a while. It will confuse a lot of people. And, sorry, hang on. One thing too, the one-time pad, we're going to get into that a lot. Why is the one-time pad good? Well, because the one-time pad is actually the perfect cipher. There's, of course, some issues where if you can make guesses, you have to make sure that your pad is secure, which is nearly impossible. That's why nobody uses it. But the funny thing about that, we'll go into this, if you're just XORing all the bytes of a message, you can XOR them back to whatever you want. So if someone's like, decrypt this drive, okay, and then you decrypt it to something totally different, but it looks like you decrypted it, and of course you can't just randomly type a different password to decrypt it differently. Well, yeah, actually, math says you can. So as far as the whole FBI and the iPhone case, if the guy they wanted was actually sophisticated enough, they could make it so, oh yeah, the iPhone just decrypted into an entirely different OS, and then they wouldn't find that, which is my way of essentially saying, hey guys, cut it out. You're not going to find that. Backdooring won't work. Try something else. Try to actually do your job. So this really actually has to stop. And so nobody actually really cares is this image plausible too? So even if you're like doing XOR ciphers and it's a PNG file, is your next-gen firewall, is that going to say, hey, that doesn't actually look like a picture, that's a bunch of random colors, I'm going to flag it? No, because how are you going to do that? You could possibly do some machine learning, but you know how many false positives you're going to have? At least for the next 30 years, that's not valid. So even if it's a bogus file that just kind of looks like that, there you go. That's a way to hide your data, hide your payloads, because nobody's gonna look at that. And so here's the key. Oh, I'm just taking in a PNG file. There's so many tools that analyze PNGs. And oh, here's a bunch of random text. Oh, but actually if I XOR them, that's malware, but you can't really blacklist that because it's in memory. Yeah, kind of fun. And so essentially this is all just lying, right? But when are you going to use Stego? Over the wire is a really good time. I always do this rant about SSL inspection, which is a huge trend. Absolutely hate it because all it does is when you get breached, your attacker's just going to go on your SSL inspection box, and then you also have to tell your employees, oh, by the way, you know how we allowed you to buy things on Amazon while you're at work? Oh, all your Amazon passwords are also lost in addition to us getting breached. So it becomes even less fun. And all you get from that, well, not really anything, because a sophisticated attacker there's essentially an infinite number of possibilities to get around that. So you cannot backdoor it. And if you're trying to avoid blacklisting, text, images, nobody cares about that. That's innocuous. And I'd say text instead of Word docs because people are now on the lookout for Word doc exploits. So but images, nobody cares. You're downloading images all the time. You're browsing the web. Nobody looks like that. And nobody can blacklist this. And so really the whole signature approach goes away. But also the reverse engineering approach, looking at the binary by a machine, it starts getting a lot harder. It's going to take more computing power. And so now we're going to go spend some time on the one-time pad and actually dig into this, because our goal here, if we have 20 minutes, we're going to then use the one-time pad and design a cipher. And this won't be a payload cipher where, honestly, if you just XOR 1 byte, you can get past most AV. A lot of times, I was actually hearing last night people joking about that. I'm like, yeah, exactly. If you do it yourself, they're not going to catch it. But I want to then make a cipher where we actually have to encrypt the data, but I want to make it so if someone's got a gun to your head and says decrypt the drive, you can decrypt it into whatever you want. So that's going to be our next goal. But we need to talk about some stuff with the one-time pad at some point. And we're going to show crypto backdoors are completely stupid. So this is kind of the current state of what people think of when they're thinking of overly encrypting, is this. But that's a valid cryptographic attack. It works. There are a lot of government officials who think that's the best way to do it and want to take keys. So let's stop the rubber hose attack. So how do you get someone to believe a lie? Everyone says you got to make them work for it. You got to make it slightly incriminating. You got to make them think they've got something. So make it look like something else. Because these days people are like, oh, crypto is strong. This is their attack. You have to be able to lie to them. You got to tell them nothing to see here. Okay, so right here I'd like to bring this up because I saw this when I was staying at some family out west, and of course, the cat is looking like it had just murdered the rabbit there. But if you give them something, because, oh, it's just the rabbit, you give them something. There might be an evil plan back there. You don't know. Incriminate yourself somewhat. And when you're trying to go with randomness, you can actually get to true random too. And so we'll go through that later. Timing wise, I don't want to go through that. And I'm sorry we're going to go through a survey, but I want to go through because at first when I gave this a small version of this talk, it was a fast 15-minute version, and there were so many things I wanted to put in, so I kind of wanted to go through everything. But now we want to design the OTP to actually create Stego. So if we want to store a key in a file, because we want to decrypt it from that file, if you have n bytes in the file that are your key, and you want to know how to find it, if someone just gives you the file, hey, there's an encryption key in here. Where is it? Oh, how many bytes are in an image? A lot. And so if you're given a file of size m and you're choosing n bytes, it's m choose n, which is a huge number because factorials are very, very big. So if you're trying to choose 8 bytes out of a 20 meg file, good luck. That's cryptographic level guessing. That's upwards of, nearly, you'll hit 2 to the 256 very fast, and it's like, oh, well, at that point, just brute force regular crypto if you have the ability to do that. So a lot of those Stego challenges, CTFs, they have to make them very flawed, because if you're really hiding random bytes, you won't get that. You need to find out what looks for it, because if someone just gives you that image, you are not going to get that. It is impossible. I would more likely see that AES would be totally broken, or would be less surprising than being able to find that. Because at that point, it's truly a wild guess. So, one thing you can do on the file, because sometimes you might have more than one file, encrypt it with a stream cipher on top of that. Even if you have a static key, that's fine. Because if you know that it's just ASCII, if you throw AES or salsa 20 over something, it's no longer just ASCII. We're actually going to run into that later when we do our example, and I'm bringing all this stuff up because when we create our example, we're going to start using these techniques and kind of interactively going through it. So I'm just laying this all out, and again, every time you do troll about security by obscurity, m choose n, big number. Problem is, though, if you're doing padding, you might not be able to decrypt. You can't use an algorithm like AES or any of that stuff that's actually very much more cryptographically secure than what we're going to do. But we have our limitations. Just like with public key crypto, we've got our limitations. We have a new set of requirements. So you're going to have some issues with padding the data, so you have to be able to do this unpadded, which is going to add a few extra challenges to us. So one thing as far as randomizing the data too that you can do is if you're encrypting it, you can also take the key. You take a key and you just hash an extra password. It's kind of a two-factor. It's not really two-factor authentication, but now you've also encrypted the message and made it even harder to mess around with. And you can essentially just so at that point you can just encrypt the data again, and it's really just for obfuscation. The extra security is just icing on the cake there. So, but one thing, too, if you need to get random integers, like if you're grabbing from a file, because sometimes you want to grab the key from a file, because you don't want to optimize this now. We're trying to obfuscate data. So optimal crypto is out the window. You don't care about how fast it is, because making it fast is very hard. And then it'll also cause more problems. And computers are very fast these days, and one-time pads are very fast. So one trick, mathematically, and we're going to run into this later, in this is if you take a prime to a power, it's always relatively prime, which all that means is it doesn't share any prime factors with anything with another number if they're relatively prime. It'll always be relatively prime to the modulus. So if you go like a prime number to the first power to the second, it's going to cycle through like a clock through those numbers. So now you've created a set of random numbers, and you can randomly raise a prime to a different power, and you get a random number. And it's a lot harder to guess, and it makes a very difficult lookup table. And so it adds some confusion. So yes, you can somewhat break the padding, but that technique makes it very hard. And pretty much all padding algorithms are based on that. Are just based on take a prime number, keep multiplying it by itself. That's it. And so, that goes into it further, that when you're choosing a prime modulus, we can We can skip that, but it's just more examples of alternating through. Why is it? Am I going the wrong way? Oh, I was hitting the wrong button. That's why. So, and then this is for the people who are actually designing crypto. You should know what a primitive root is. Always use a primitive root. You will otherwise break the cycle and your randomness dies. So you always want to use a primitive root. All that means is that, so by Euler's theorem, a to the phi of n mod n is always equal to 1, where phi is the number of values less than n relatively prime to n. If in that case you have that, you can still, just because it equals 1, there's other values where it can cycle earlier. So if your loop is a lot shorter, you have a lot fewer values that can go into there. So always use a primitive root. And that's a lot of times in the self-implemented Diffie-Hellmans. That's what people forget, and then they cause problems. And so generally, as a rule of thumb, that will do that. So when you're doing one-time pad stuff, the problem is your key is as big as the message. So you have to find a way to hide the key on the box without having the key. So you have to unlock the key, but it's big. You can't just pad that out from a password because you have low entropy. And then also, if you're given a password, what is easier? A password that you know yourself and you made, or one that's given to you? One that's given to you is so much harder to remember, and you're not going to be able to, with a gun to your head, remember your fake password as easily unless you came up with it. So that's going to become an interesting requirement when we start doing the anti-rubber hose stego. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take, so there's going to be 3 ciphertexts, your random data, and then 2 keys. The keys itself are a ciphertext because you're essentially XORing it with the random data, which becomes your ciphertext. So what happens is we're going to design this so we have our 2 plain texts that we want, and then our ciphertext. And so what'll happen is we are then going to be able to have 2 different plain texts and be able to decrypt the data into fake data. So let's go ahead and design a crypto algorithm right here. So in this situation, you need to have it so that the user can type a password. It'll decrypt their data. They type a different password of their choice, and it decrypts 2 other data. So how are we going to do this? We're going to choose R as a random set of bytes. It can be anything. Just make it random. As we know, true random is possible if you want to do that. So eventually, you could actually make the reason I brought up the true randomness, it wasn't just a random tangent. What I was talking about there is someone might say, oh, it's not mathematically impossible to show that you can decrypt data into whatever you want. But I'm trying to say, yes, that randomness can be perfect. So if the FBI wants a crypto backdoor, they're just being really, really stupid because here you go. That's how you break whatever backdoor you're doing. So continuing down, you have your 2 messages, right? You have your fake data, that's kind of incriminating but not quite. And then you have your file that you don't want anyone to ever see. Then you have to pick 2 passphrases. And so you take the passphrases and you make a lookup table with all the keys. So you take the keys, and the keys are just XORed with the message and the randomness. And now you have to make it so that if you type in a passphrase, it looks up the right keys. It images and files whatever you want on the system. Be creative. But here's the problem. If you only have 26 possibilities for the password, or however many ASCII characters, 255, 255 is an incredibly small number for a computer. Now, one thing that helped, because I was looking at this, and I was like, because this was really bugging me for a while, and I was going through designing. This was actually my thought process, was, well, how do we make a bigger character set? Well, if the password was in Mandarin, it'd be so much easier because you have a 20,000 character set, which is significantly bigger than 26. So actually, in some areas, language in passwords can affect the security of the crypto itself. So, but the guy using it doesn't speak Mandarin. Crap. Okay, so we got to work with a non-pictographic language. So you take what we're going to do is take character groups of size 3, map them with different parts of the key. Why size 3? Because 255 to the third comes a lot closer to 20,000, and now we actually have some expectation of security. So essentially what you would do is you take a hex value, longer hex values, you take parts of the passphrase, break them up, right? So we're going to break them up, make a lookup table. And you can also do something fancy, put them in images like we were talking about earlier, right? You can take them up, put them in a lookup table, and then, so you take it from the passphrase, then you take all the other 3-letter combinations, right? Random data, right? So now, if you don't know the password, there's just random data. You have a cipher text, which is just random bytes, and the algorithm to decrypt them is XOR it with a key. Here's the thing. If you XOR it with any key, you can make it anything you want. So, known plaintext doesn't work. Oh yeah, I XORed it. That must be the key. That's the password. Do you know? No. Is there any way to find out? Mathematically impossible. Okay. So there you go. So now we have that. Here's a problem. Where did we mess up? And this is why sometimes people don't always implementing your own crypto can be a bad idea. If the message is only in ASCII, and it doesn't have any other byte, if it just has those characters, if those random values that are on different values that are not the password, you can eliminate part of that password when you're looking through it. So that's one attack on this that we realized would work. So you can either make it so that you can detect, oh, it's ASCII data, I'm only going to make my lookup table that way. Or one way you can do that is you can throw AES over there. So essentially, back to what we were looking at earlier, what was our problem? We had a flaw in our entropy. So it wasn't all for nothing, that discussion. We had a flaw in our entropy. So how do we fix it? So what we can do is we can just throw AES over it. Doesn't matter, standard key. We have the confusion diffusion, but we're using it for the right thing. We're using it to confuse or diffuse. If you want to put a 2-factor, then you can have that password in there, and if someone's ever seen you and screen surfed you, now it looks legitimate when they have the gun to your head and say, type the password. So at that point, you can actually obfuscate that data. Now, one issue is if you had that as your message, what's the problem here? If everyone knows that the message the gold is hidden at, now you've stolen most of the password. Entropy failure again. So, what can you actually do to fix that? Well, it's the same method. However, one kind of funny thing with this is there's no rule that you have to only have 2 plain texts. So you could have an infinite amount of plain texts or of all the possibilities of where the gold is buried. So someone will guess your password and they'll be like, oh crap, all the other passphrases show the other longitudes and latitudes. Now, there's no way, and they already were like, oh, we got that! So that they killed their hostage, right? Who has the key to that? Oh, crap. It decrypts into every other possible possibility we don't have anything. So you could troll with that. While I was fixing that, I realized it would be a funny way to troll with this methodology. I hope you guys are following on. I really wanted to do this as let's try to create this together because I would love for us to start making crypto methods, because here's the thing that's happening right now is we are losing trust in what government might do with crypto, and right now we're putting a lot of trust in NIST. So if we forget how to do this, we've got a major problem. So let's just go up through our flaws. So we can use AES to randomize the data and just as a randomization method to make it so it's not all text. We can, for the password length, it could be a multiple of 3. Multiple of 3, we need to pad it. How do we pad it? Well, with p to the n. You can take the password, the old part of the password, take a prime number, raise it to that power. Now you have a random value. It's hard to guess when you're brute forcing the password. It's going to be very difficult. It's easier when the password's a multiple of 3 or whatever you choose for your character length. But at that point, you can actually pad it safely. And so that's why we mentioned that method is that's a legitimate padding method. And so let's go to the takeaways of this. Because at this point now, it seems like it's a legit crypto system. I'm still going to look at it. If you guys have any issues with any flaws with this, I'm going to post an implementation up to GitHub. Let's talk about it. Because I really want to have this anti-rubber hose crypto out there, essentially as a message. Because we know the problems with master keys, right? We know, look at the TSA keys. How many of us have TSA keys that were given by people in the community that are essentially backdoors to luggage. There's a significant risk. But I want to show people who think that there should be a master key somewhere, there's no reward either. An adversary can use techniques like this, and you can't force people to decrypt their drive. At customs, why do you make someone decrypt their drive? First of all, they're going to use Steganography, they're going to send it over the internet. You can't firewall that off your country. I mean, everyone knows there's the Great Firewall of China, but how many people are able to get on their Facebooks and Twitters while they're in China? I mean, come on. It's kind of an illusion. They're making it an additional barrier, but the point of, at customs, decrypt your laptop. That's stupid. And I wanted to even take that to the point to mathematically show that that is stupid. And so, over Stego, as I said, infinite possibilities, Morty, but yeah, that's the truth there. Anything can look like anything. If you have, say, let's put the data, we have something that we can alter, there's an infinite number of things. There's an infinite number of protocols that could possibly be made. So, at this point, there's no real way to change that. Next-gen heuristics can't really be done over the network except for some blatant things over like where is this connecting. But any real adversaries can use a botnet anyway, so who really cares? So, and then even with the data at rest, you can now have an encryption method where you don't know if it's the right crypto. Therefore, rubber hose attack has gone away. Hope you guys followed along. I want to go through my thank yous. So, Net Thunder, my company, Kyle and all the crew who put on Derbycon yesterday. Any of you guys go to Derbycon, have some barbecue? Yeah, so it's at Kyle's house, followed on Twitter, but the Thursday before Derbycon every year, go there. So thank you guys, LDN, Cameron for helping with the demo, and we're going to get that up on GitHub, and Neil for waking me up this morning. My phone died. And at Derbycon and everyone putting this together, thank you guys for coming. I hope I didn't bore you guys. There's a lot to go through. If you have questions, contact info, Twitter, email me. Let's talk about this. There was a lot to go through. I'm going to try to put the slides up on GitHub, put a demo up on GitHub, and we can work on something like this. Are there any questions? Questions?